So again, welcome. This is the Community Organizing to Reach Domestic Workers Application Information session. My name is Courtney Velasquez. I am an engagement specialist with the Seattle Office of Labor Standards. Here's the agenda that we'll cover for today. We'll give a brief history about the Office of Labor Standards. We'll talk about, just at a high level, the domestic worker protections and coverage. And then we'll also talk about the Domestic Worker Standards Board and where and how the money for this project came about. And then we'll spend most of the time on the application process and making sure that everyone's clear on how to apply and what's required. And then we'll take time for questions and answers. If you do have questions that come up along the way, feel free to either raise your hand or put it in the chat. I can only see a limited number of squares on my screen, so I'll ask Becca and Lane to just let me know when questions come up. So with that, a little bit of background about the Seattle Office of Labor Standards. The city passed its first labor standard that went into effect in 2012, and our office was created in 2015 to implement and enforce the city's labor standards. So prior to 2015, we were part of the Seattle Office for Civil Rights, and then we became our own office. Our mission for the Office of Labor Standards is to advance workplace equity, and we do that specifically by engaging communities and businesses, by strategically enforcing the laws, and then developing innovative policies, all with a grounding to race and social justice. As I mentioned, the first labor standard in Seattle that went into effect was paid sick and safe time. And this is a law that requires that employees who perform work in Seattle must be provided with paid leave to take care of themselves and family members for health issues, and then also safety issues that are related to domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. As we said, our office became an office in 2015, and in April of 2022, we celebrated our 7-year anniversary as an office. And as of April, our investigators had resolved 989 cases, which resulted in almost $25 million in remedies to more than 40,000 workers. And actually, since then, there have been other cases that have been resolved and then more remedies won. So very excited about those. And this screen shows the 17 laws that the Office of Labor Standards enforces as of 2022. So the first 4 that are listed are the oldest and then the broadest. So they have the broadest coverage for employees and workers, and then apply to the most number of businesses and employers. So we mentioned paid sick and safe time. Fair chance employment refers to limits on the use of background checks during the hiring process. The minimum wage, the Seattle minimum wage, increases each year, and so that's something that needs to be followed. And then wage theft is a protection that makes sure that employees and workers are getting the pay that they are legally entitled to. The rest of the laws apply to certain types of workers or industries. And so for today, we'll be talking about and focusing on domestic workers, but just know that there are other protections in Seattle for hotel employees, gig workers during the COVID pandemic, transportation network company drivers, which are Uber and Lyft rideshare drivers, and then independent contractors that are freelance workers. A quick note about the TNC rideshare driver protections. Those will be in effect through December 31st, 2022. And then after that, there is a statewide law that applies to transportation network company drivers, and that will go into effect January of 2023, and that will be administered by the Washington State Department of Labor and Industries. And they're working on standing up that new law. So there'll be more to come about that, but it will be transitioning from Seattle and then going to the state level. So the Domestic Workers Ordinance or law passed in 2018 and became effective in 2019. And want to just pause and recognize that domestic workers fought for and gained they organized and gained these protections. And so it was domestic workers who worked with worker organizations and community and organized themselves to pass these protections. And so like the other laws that are the labor standards that are provided in Seattle, it's all the result of workers organizing themselves and work with worker rights organizations to advance these protections. And so there's a link, and we'll post this, but you can see on our website, there's more detailed information about the law and the protections. But in terms of who is covered, so the Domestic Workers Ordinance or law covers domestic workers, and it includes both employees and independent contractors who provide paid services to an individual or household in a private home for these 6 different type of workers. And so it's nannies, house cleaners, home care workers, gardeners, cooks, and household managers in these private home settings. And a quick note that the home care workers who are paid through public funds are actually not covered with this and under this law. And I think, was there a question? I'm gonna stop sharing for a second. Did you have a question, or was there a question that?
No, you already answered. Thank you.
Okay, great. So we talked about the types of domestic workers that are covered. These are the protections that are provided under the law. So this law requires that for domestic work that is done in Seattle, domestic workers must be paid Seattle's minimum wage. Domestic workers must be provided with meal periods and rest breaks. And then for domestic workers who are live-in workers, they must be provided a day of rest after working more than 6 consecutive days. And then the 4th protection is that domestic workers must be able to retain or keep their own original documents or personal effects. And that includes identification, passports, and things like that. And so this is just a very high level mentioning of the protections. There's a lot more detailed information, and there's a question and answer guide related to the Domestic Workers Ordinance. I'm gonna go to the next screen and I'll talk about the board, and then I'll ask Lane to add in anything. So another thing that the Domestic Workers Protections or the law provided is that it created a Domestic Worker Standards Board. And this is a board that now consists of 13 members, and it gives a way for domestic workers and employers, as well as households in the public, to provide feedback and suggestions to continue improving the working conditions for domestic workers. This is an advisory board that meets monthly, and earlier in 2022, the Domestic Worker Standards Board had organized and did a series of workshops to do anti-racist budget planning. And so the board had advocated for and got from City Council one-time funding to advance the work of the domestic workers protections and the board. And so one of the budget recommendations that came out was to expand outreach to communities and domestic workers themselves. And so that's the funding that we have. I'm going to pause there and see, Lane, do you have things that you want to share or say about the board or coverage and protections?
There's so much to say, so I'm happy to take questions if anyone has any questions. I just also want to add, there's more information on our website about some of the activities of the Domestic Worker Standards Board, and the one-time funding that Courtney mentioned, that is funding these organizing grants, came from work that they had done earlier to submit recommendations to the mayor and to city council. And part of that was really about funding community partners in particular to do the work to go deeper into different parts of the broader domestic worker community that you know uh, that haven't had as much outreach so far, either through community partners or from OLS directly, but to really work with partners that are already have built trusted relationships with folks who are working in this space.
Thanks, Lane. And I'll go back to sharing. So that brings us to the main reason why everyone's here, is just talking about the funding, the opportunity that's available now. And so this is the community organizing to reach domestic workers. It's 4 activities that will begin in 2022 and then continue into the end of 2023. And so, as I've mentioned, the purpose is to help the Office of Labor Standards to build wider and then also deeper connections with domestic workers in communities of color, so that they are able to understand and know their domestic worker rights in Seattle, so that they can access those protections. What we mean by wider and deeper connections is like expanding via different racial and ethnic and language groups. We're also looking at like the full range of the 6 types of domestic workers, and then also really looking inside as well as outside Seattle in terms of the geographic reach. And we recognize that due to displacement and gentrification, it's really expensive for folks to live in Seattle. And so folks have had to move farther outside into different counties, but still perform work in Seattle. So that's kind of the expansion. The projects, in keeping with the recommendations of the Domestic Workers Standards Board for the anti-racist budgeting, the projects will give preference to projects that use a clear organizing strategy. So for example, a peer-to-peer model of domestic workers or community members reaching out and connecting with other community members to reach domestic workers. Projects that involve mutually benefiting relationships, and so where different partners are each contributing in their own ways, and then also each benefiting in their own. And these projects will give priority to building and expanding relationships in Asian Pacific Islander and Black African descent communities. And so just to be really specific, we're talking about Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities that include Polynesia, Micronesia, Melanesia, and then Asian communities that include South Asian, East Asian, Southeast Asian, and then Black African descent communities that include African American, East African, West African, Afro-Latino, and other communities that identify as being African descent. This is just, again, an overview of the funding, and this information is included in the application packet. And so the eligible organizations are nonprofit organizations or grassroots groups that have a nonprofit fiscal sponsor. As mentioned, this is one-time funding, and so that means that the funds are available for the project period and they are not renewable. The total amount available is $250,000, and of that, at least $50,000 will be awarded for projects in Asian Pacific Islander communities, and then at least $50,000 will be awarded for projects in Black African descent communities. So the amount that projects can request ranges from $25,000 to up to $57,000. And OLS is looking to award may award up to 8 projects, and the project period would be starting October 1st of 2022 and then going through December 31st of 2023. So 15 months, 1-5. For projects that are awarded funding, the requirements will be to do a monthly invoice. And there was a sample template that's included in the application packet as attachment 5 so that you can see just what the what the administrative responsibility will be. And so the invoice also includes identifying the groups by racial and ethnic group, the type of domestic workers, and then geographic areas that your project is working to reach for each month. And then providing just a brief update about this status update of what's going on with your project from month to month. The 2 types of deliverables that will be required by the end of the project period are, the first one is that projects will be required to attend a domestic workers standards board meeting in 2023. And that will be an opportunity to share about the project, to talk about what you're doing, what you're seeing, and then also for projects to network with board members, the domestic worker standards board members, as well as OLS staff and other community organizers and projects to really share resources. And the second deliverable will be to complete and submit one project summary report that's no more than 2 pages by the end of the project period. So by December 31st, 2023, it will be a written report that talks about the successes, the challenges, and then what the project has done to address those challenges, and then recommendations to OLS and to the Domestic Worker Standards Board for best practices in doing outreach to the specific communities. I believe there was a question. Is that right? Sige, did you have a question about?
Yeah,
Go
is
ahead.
this only in Seattle, or we can incorporate our counties like Kent and other places?
Good question. So you can do the activities in Kent, outside of Seattle, but it's all related to protections for work that is done in Seattle. So as long as that part, so we understand that domestic workers live all throughout the region, and so your engagement and how you connect with them may be in other areas, and that's fine, as long as what you're communicating to them is clear that it's for these protections apply to work, that domestic work that they do when that is done in Seattle. Does that make sense?
It does, but I have another question
Yes.
related to that too. And also, if you can talk more about what kind of activity, you roughly mentioned that, but what kind of activity we can do with this project?
So activities, so one of the models that the board mentioned is a peer-to-peer engaging or organizing model. So in many communities, it's referred to as like promoters or promotores. And it's I think there's examples from different Latin American countries where it's taking information and then sharing and educating community members to go out and connect with and find other community members to talk to as peers. So if you have domestic workers in your community that you know of, and then they're educated and aware of their rights, and then they're sharing that. We also recognize that in different communities, folks might not know if there are, or you might have an idea that there might be some domestic workers, but you might not have already established relationships with domestic workers. So it might be something very different that is the community's own plan to identify, like, are there workers who are doing nanny work or home care work in private homes in your community? And then, what would be your plan for how to identify where to reach or who to talk to? So it might be more like kind of a starting point to lay out a plan. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Okay. I don't think there were any other questions at this time, so I'll keep going. Yes. So I mentioned the final report by the end of the project period. So a few reminders about key dates and the requirements for applying. So the application is due by Monday, July 11th at 5 p.m. via email, and the email is listed in the application itself. And a complete application will include a completed cover sheet, a completed budget sheet, and then the answers to the application questions. And that is maximum 2 pages. And so all of that together, you would send via email. The timeline for making decisions for the Office of Labor Standards to make decisions will be about a month. So we expect that award decisions will be made by middle of August. So then we can negotiate and execute the contracts with awarded projects by the end of September. And so then projects can start promptly October 1st. And so in terms of what makes a strong application, we included in the application packet rating criteria. So we identified the questions in one column and then the points available. And then the criteria are the things that the review committee members will use to look at and see and score each application. So when you're answering the questions, please just be as clear and concise as possible, but also make sure that the answers that you're providing are directly linked to the questions and the criteria. So we recognize that 2 pages is not a lot of space, and so just to be as specific and as clear as possible. So here's the link to the funding page on our OLS website, and it has more of the summary information, as well as the application available in English and Spanish. We do ask, just for our capacity and due to a tight timeline, that applications must be completed in English. If that will be a barrier or a challenge for anyone, please reach out to us and let us know, and we can try to work and identify resources that may help you to submit the application in English. And then again, my contact information, you can reach me via email or phone, and I can answer questions all the way up through the closing date, so through July 11th at 5 p.m. And at this time, we want to open it up for other questions. I'll also ask Lane if there's anything that you wanted to add that I missed.
Anything to add? Thanks, Courtney, but happy to answer questions.
Zara?
Yeah, no, actually, I just didn't have no question, but it was really good information to hear that. So, yeah, it's almost over. Yeah, one of my coworker want to be joined right now, but it's almost over. But yeah, but we have all the information.
Great.
And I know easy going on. Like, yeah, Courtney. Yeah. So I almost want to say Courtney to say join us, but it's already too late. This is Courtney.
Hello.
Yeah. So thank you so much. It's really good information, and we can go from there. I know we kind of a little bit partner with Fair World Center, but we just want to make sure, if we can apply this one or they already applied. So we just kind of have that clarify a little bit. But I really appreciate it. This is really great.
Zara, you bring up a great point, and so it's totally up to each organization. If you want to apply as partners under one or if you want each organization to apply for its own,
Okay.
it's entirely up to you. Just know that the maximum amount for any one application is the 57,000. So
7,000. Yeah,
however, mhm,
that's good.
so,
Thank you.
yeah,
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
thank you.
Uh-huh.
Any other questions from folks? I think, so a question from Sujin. So the question in the chat is, the narrative length should only be 2 pages. Can we create a response that doesn't include the questions in order to create space? Yes. So we provided, you can create like, in your own Word document or something, just the answers to the questions. We ask that you just at least number your responses so that we can, so that the reviewers, it will be easier for them. They are looking at specific criteria and scores for each question. So they'll need to identify it by the question, but you don't have to rephrase the question. Great. Any other questions? And we'll wait a few minutes to see if there's something that comes to mind for folks, but if anyone feels like you have enough information, then you're more than welcome to log out also. But if for anyone else who wants to stay on, and
If people have questions later, who should they ask?
great question. I see your hand, Sara. One sec. So if other questions come to mind, then you can go ahead and email me, and
Okay.
I'll just put in the chat again my email. It's on the application itself, but in the meantime, Sara.
Yeah, one question Courtney want to ask.
Yeah, so I didn't catch most of this meeting because I wasn't as, maybe you recorded this. Would I have access somewhere to be able to watch and catch up on everything that I've missed?
Yes, so we are recording. We will be posting it. I think it will take us into next week. So if you, more than likely by the middle of next week, it will be posted.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right.
So I put my direct email in the chat for any follow-up questions. We'll give it one more minute to see if there are questions or clarification. And if not, we really appreciate your time. We do encourage you to talk to others. And great. Thank you, Sara. And let them know that this is available. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording.
Thank you.